I found out I was no longer invited to my own family's New Year's celebration through a calm, reasonable phone call that left no room for argument. They said it would be better this way, lighter, simpler, easier without me there. I agreed, hung up, and sat alone with the quiet, realizing something inside me had cracked for good. What they did not know, what no one bothered to ask, was that I had already been erased once before, and this time the silence they pushed me into was no longer empty. It was loaded, patient, and about to change everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old, and I live alone in a small cedar-sided house on the edge of Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountains soften the mornings and the fog arrives before I do. People often describe this town as peaceful, which is another way of saying that nothing here demands your attention unless you choose to give it. I have learned to appreciate that kind of quiet. After my husband died, the house learned my habits quickly. It stopped expecting footsteps in the evenings and accepted that one mug would always be enough. Most mornings begin the same way. I wake before the sun, boil water for tea, and stand by the kitchen window while the kettle hums. The trees behind the house hold the cold longer than the street does, and I like watching the light move slowly through them. There is comfort in routines that do not rush you. On Tuesdays, I attend a book club at the local library for people who are old enough to be overlooked. On Fridays, I walk to the farmer's market even when I do not need anything, just to remind myself that the world is still moving. For more than 30 years, I worked in insurance risk analysis. It was not a job that came with applause. My work lived in spreadsheets, projections, and worst-case scenarios no one wanted to imagine until they happened. I built models that help companies survive storms, lawsuits, and sudden losses. When things went well, no one noticed. When things went wrong, they asked how it could have been prevented. I learned early that usefulness does not guarantee visibility. I did not mind. I liked being precise. I liked knowing that something held because I had calculated the pressure correctly. That habit followed me home. In my family, I became the person who was always fine. My son, Daniel, is 38 and successful by any measure that shows up on paper. He works long hours, speaks quickly, and treats time like something that can be negotiated. When people ask about me, he usually says the same thing, that I am doing well and that nothing much changes. Once, I overheard him say it with a smile that sounded rehearsed. "She's fine, nothing new." He did not mean it unkindly. It was simply how he understood me. I do not blame him for that. I taught him to see me that way. After my husband passed, I made a point of not becoming a problem. I kept my grief tidy. I paid my bills early. I answered questions before they were asked. Over time, that reliability turned into a kind of invisibility. I was present, but rarely consulted, acknowledged but not considered. I told myself this was the natural order of things, that mothers eventually fade into the background once their usefulness has been fully extracted. Yet there were moments when that explanation felt thin. Late at night, when the house settled and the mountain air pressed against the windows, I sometimes sensed that my life was paused rather than finished. I still read industry journals. I still took notes in the margins. I still saw patterns where others saw noise. None of it had anywhere to go, and I had grown accustomed to that containment. If you had asked anyone who knew me then, They would have said I was steady, predictable, and content. They would have been mostly right. What they would not have said, what they did not think to ask, was whether being fine was the same as being done. That assumption, quiet and unchallenged, shaped everything that came next. If you're still watching and starting to feel how quietly being overlooked can shape a life, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. What comes next is the moment that turns silent acceptance into something far more dangerous. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. The last week of December always settles over Asheville with a particular stillness. The town slows down, as if the mountains insist on a pause before anything new is allowed to begin. That year, I felt the pause more acutely. I had already bought a train ticket into the city, folded neatly into the drawer beside my bed. I told myself it was practical to plan ahead, even if no one had asked yet. Habits like that do not disappear just because circumstances change. I did not expect a party or anything elaborate. New Year's Eve, for our family, had never been about spectacle. It was about being in the same room when the calendar turned, about shared quiet more than shared noise. I imagined sitting near the window in Daniel's apartment, watching reflections of fireworks in the glass while conversations drifted around me. I even wrapped a small gift, something unobtrusive that would not require explanation. The expectation was modest, almost cautious, and that made it feel safe. Daniel called 3 days before the holiday. His voice carried the pace of someone already late for something else. He spoke carefully, as though choosing words that would not require follow-up. He explained that this year would be different, that the gathering was larger, more professional, and not the right environment for me. He framed it as consideration, as if he were sparing me discomfort. I listened without interrupting, holding the phone lightly, noticing how easily the explanation slid into place. When the call ended, I remained standing in the kitchen for a long moment. The kettle had cooled. The room smelled faintly of lemon from the cleaner I had used earlier. There was no sharp pain, no rush of anger. Instead, there was a familiar sinking recognition. I had not been forgotten. I had been assessed and excluded with intention. That distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. I opened the drawer and took out the train ticket. The paper made a soft sound when I tore it cleanly down the middle. I did not hesitate. I placed the pieces in the trash and closed the lid. The action felt decisive, in a way my emotions had not yet caught up with. Later that afternoon, I returned the wrapped gift to the closet shelf, tucking it behind a row of scarves I rarely wore anymore. On the evening of December 31st, I cooked a simple meal and ate it at the kitchen table. I did not turn on the television. I did not scroll through messages or check the time more than necessary. Outside, the air grew colder, and the sky darkened earlier than usual. I thought about previous years, about the way I had once hovered at the edges of conversations, grateful simply to be included. This year, there was nothing to hover near. As midnight approached, the house grew so quiet that I could hear the refrigerator cycle on and off. The clock on the wall moved steadily, indifferent to the significance people assigned to numbers. When the moment arrived, there were no cheers or countdowns. The year changed without ceremony, and I sat with that fact longer than I expected. A few minutes later, my phone lit up on the table. I did not reach for it right away. I watched the screen glow against the wood, an unexpected interruption in the stillness I had just begun to accept. Something about the timing unsettled me. This was not a holiday greeting or a delayed apology. Whatever waited on the other end felt heavier than that. I let the phone fall dark again before I picked it up. By then, I understood that the quiet exclusion of that night was not an ending. It was a threshold, and I had just stepped over it without realizing how far the ground would shift beneath me. If you're still watching, and that New Year's exclusion hit closer to home than you expected, comment number 2 below so I know you're still here. Because what happened next wasn't about family, it was about betrayal where it hurts the most. Let's move on to chapter 3. 6 months before that New Year's Eve, I was still reporting to an office I had walked into for decades without thinking. The building smelled the same as it always had, a mix of recycled air and burnt coffee, and the elevators still hesitated between floors as if unsure where they belonged. I arrived early that morning, as I usually did, and set my bag beneath my desk. Nothing about the day announced itself as significant. That, I would later understand, was part of the design. I had spent more than 30 years with the company, long enough to watch systems evolve and repeat themselves. My role had never been loud, but it had been central. I built risk frameworks that guided decisions no one wanted to take responsibility for. When losses were avoided, the credit dispersed into the room. When something failed, the questions quietly circled back to my spreadsheets. I accepted that arrangement because it worked, and because I believed competence, over time, was enough. The meeting invitation appeared on my calendar without explanation. It was labeled as a brief check-in, scheduled for mid-morning, and included 2 people from human resources whom I barely knew. The conversation unfolded exactly as such meetings always do. The language was gentle, rehearsed, and oddly impersonal. They spoke about restructuring, about streamlining, about offering me the option to step away early with dignity. No one mentioned performance. No one mentioned my work. I listened carefully, not because I was surprised, but because something did not align. I asked a few questions, measured and polite, and received answers that were technically complete and emotionally empty. When the meeting ended, I shook hands, gathered my things, and returned to my desk. Around me, the office continued as if nothing had happened. Phones rang. Emails arrived. The machinery did not pause for departures. It was not until later that week that the truth surfaced. I logged in to review a file I had maintained for years and found my access restricted. The model itself was still there, updated and active, but my name no longer appeared anywhere in its history. I traced the changes carefully, following the logic the way I always had. Someone had lifted my work cleanly, integrated it into a new structure, and erased the trail that led back to me. I did not feel anger in that moment. What I felt was clarity. This was not an oversight. It was a replacement. The company had decided it no longer needed the person attached to the knowledge, only the knowledge itself. I packed the few personal items from my desk and carried them to my car without ceremony. The sky that afternoon was low and gray, pressing down on the parking lot like a lid. At home, I opened the boxes I had stored for years, notebooks filled with calculations, margin notes, and early drafts of ideas that had never made it past internal review. I spread them across the dining table and read through them slowly. Patterns emerged that I had not had time to explore before. More importantly, I noticed gaps in the company's claims of ownership. The agreements I had signed covered employment, not authorship. The models, in their earliest forms, predated those contracts. I closed the notebooks and sat back, letting the information settle. Silence, I realized, could be a form of leverage if used deliberately. I did not contact a lawyer. I did not send emails or demand explanations. Instead, I documented everything and waited. For the first time since I had been asked to step aside, I no longer felt discarded. I felt prepared. That was the moment something shifted. The betrayal at work mirrored a pattern I recognized elsewhere in my life, one where usefulness was mistaken for replaceability. I stopped asking whether I still belonged and began asking what I could build on my own terms. The answer was already in front of me, spread across the table, waiting for me to claim it. If you're still watching and beginning to realize how quietly people can replace you while smiling to your face, comment number 3 below to let me know you're following closely. The next chapter is where silence stops being weakness and becomes strategy. Let's continue to chapter 4. When I stopped going into the office, the days did not collapse the way people warned me they would. They widened. Without meetings to break time into defensible pieces, I learned how long a morning could actually be. I kept my old habits at first, waking early, making tea, sitting at the table with my notebook spread out as if someone might call and ask for an update. No one did. The silence was clean, unencumbered by expectation, and it allowed me to think in full sentences again. I began by organizing what I already had. Years of notebooks, folders, archived files, and printed models that had once lived on shared servers were laid out with care. I treated the process the way I always had: methodical, patient, unwilling to skip steps. I recreated frameworks from memory, then improved them without worrying about approvals or optics. I removed compromises I had once made to satisfy committees. The work felt lighter without losing its rigor. Forming the company was straightforward. I registered Brooks Risk Logic LLC with the state, opened a separate business account, and set up a modest legal structure that protected my authorship without drawing attention. I did not build a website. I did not announce anything. There was no launch to prepare for, no audience to convince. The company existed because I needed a container for the work, not because I wanted it to be seen. My first clients came quietly, through people who knew the value of discretion. A rural hospital asked for help evaluating coverage gaps they could not afford to misjudge. A small pension fund wanted a second opinion on projections that had never quite added up. A county office needed a model that accounted for risks their consultants kept smoothing over. These were not glamorous requests. They were precise, and they mattered. I accepted them one by one, pricing fairly, delivering thoroughly, and moving on. The income was steady, not dramatic. That suited me. I tracked expenses carefully and reinvested where it made sense. More importantly, I felt something I had not felt in years: autonomy. I worked without interruption, refined models without compromise, and made decisions based on outcomes rather than appearances. The absence of oversight did not make the work reckless. It made it honest. Daniel learned about the company the way he learned most things about my life, indirectly and without context. During a brief call, he asked what I had been up to lately. I told him I was consulting. He paused, then said it sounded like a good way to stay busy. I did not correct him. The explanation he had constructed was sufficient for his purposes, and clarifying it would have changed nothing. I noticed that this no longer bothered me. What surprised me was how useful that misunderstanding became. Being underestimated removed friction. People did not probe. They did not hover. They did not attempt to redirect my focus. I moved through my workdays without interference, building something durable at a pace I controlled. The models improved quickly once they were freed from unnecessary constraints. Patterns emerged that had been invisible before, connections sharpened by continuity rather than interruption. I kept my personal life unchanged. I attended book club. I walked to the market. I cooked simple meals and read late into the evening. There was no external marker of progress, no visible signal that anything was different. That invisibility felt earned this time, not imposed. It protected the work while it grew into itself. As the months passed, I understood that what I was building did not need witnesses yet. It needed accuracy, patience, and time. I was no longer interested in being believed. I was interested in being right. And for the first time, I could be both without explaining myself to anyone. If you're still watching and wondering why being underestimated might actually be power, comment number 4 below so I know you're still with me, because the next part changes everything, and no one sees it coming. Now, let's move on to chapter 5. By the time the message arrived, My routines had settled into something steady and unremarkable. Months had passed since I started working independently, and the days no longer felt provisional. I knew which mornings required full concentration and which could absorb interruptions. I knew which clients needed reassurance and which needed silence. The work had a rhythm, and I trusted it. The inquiry did not announce itself as important. It came through a referral from a regional pension fund I had helped earlier in the year, forwarded with a single line that suggested I might be useful. The sender represented a European reinsurance firm with interest in the United States market. The tone was restrained, professional, and specific. They had reviewed a sample of my models and wanted to understand how I arrived at certain conclusions that differed from industry norms. I did not respond immediately. I read the message twice, then once more the following morning. Years in risk analysis had taught me that urgency was rarely a sign of value. I replied with a brief acknowledgement and proposed a structured conversation. When we spoke, the discussion stayed technical. There were no pleasantries, no curiosity about my background, no questions about scale or branding. They asked about assumptions, stress tests, and edge cases. I answered carefully, referencing data rather than instinct. What struck me most was what they did not ask. No one questioned my age. No one asked who else was on my team. The work was treated as sufficient on its own. Over several weeks, the conversations continued, widening to include legal counsel and independent auditors. They verified the models against historical failures, confirmed projections across multiple scenarios, and returned with follow-up questions that demonstrated seriousness rather than skepticism. It was during those discussions that the leverage I had prepared quietly came into focus. The firm wanted not just access, but ownership. They needed clarity on authorship and rights. I had documented every step of the model's development, including dates that predated my employment agreements. The gaps I had identified months earlier were no longer theoretical. They were actionable. The negotiations remained civil, almost understated, but each point was precise. Nothing was rushed. The offer arrived in stages, its scale emerging gradually. First, a framework, then terms, then a valuation that exceeded what I had allowed myself to imagine. I read the numbers without reacting, recalculating them in my head as I had done with countless projections before. The figure was large, yes, but what mattered more was its structure. Part of the compensation would be placed into a discrete trust, designed to manage long-term obligations and limit immediate exposure. Public clarity would come later, on a timeline that suited regulatory requirements rather than spectacle. I signed the final documents at my kitchen table on an ordinary afternoon. The soup on the stove needed stirring, and the light outside was already fading. There was no one to call, no impulse to mark the moment. I signed, scanned, and filed the papers with the same care I brought to everything else. When it was done, I turned back to the stove and finished preparing dinner. Only later, when the house had quieted again, did I sit and allow the confirmation to settle. Nothing in my surroundings reflected what had changed. The shelves were the same. The air moved through the trees as it always had, yet the future had shifted decisively, not because of luck or recognition, but because patience had been correctly applied. I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned. The work had found its scale, and I had not been required to make myself smaller or louder to achieve it. For the first time, the silence I had cultivated was not a shield. It was proof. January 1st arrived without ceremony. The morning light crept in through the kitchen window, the same way it always did, thin and pale, catching on the rim of my mug as I poured tea. Outside, the street was quiet, the neighborhood still sleeping off celebrations I had not attended. Nothing in the air suggested that anything was different, and I moved through the early hours with the same deliberate calm I had cultivated for months. I did not seek out the news. It found me anyway, in fragments. An email alert from a trade publication I still subscribed to mentioned a finalized acquisition in the reinsurance sector. A second message followed, this one from a former colleague whose name I had not seen in years, asking if the article referred to me. I read both without urgency, noting the language, the placement, the restraint. My name appeared without decoration, folded neatly into the facts. There was no commentary, no speculation, just confirmation. By mid-morning, my phone began to register its own quiet protest. Missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, stacked one after another. Emails arrived faster than I cared to open them, their subject lines hinting at interest rather than concern. I set the device face down on the counter and finished my tea. Attention, I had learned, did not require immediate response to remain real. It was Daniel's call that I answered. I recognized the number before the phone stopped ringing, and I understood what it meant that he was calling now, rather than later. His voice carried none of its usual certainty. He sounded careful, as if he were stepping onto unfamiliar ground without knowing where it might give way. He asked whether the reports were true, whether I was involved in what people were already discussing around him. I told him that I was. I did not add context or explanation. The silence that followed felt different from the ones I had grown used to. This was not absence. It was recalibration. I could hear him adjusting his understanding of me in real time, searching for a version of the past that would make this development make sense. As he spoke, I realized that the questions had reversed themselves. For years, I had been the one absorbing assumptions, smoothing over gaps, making myself legible to others. Now, he was the one uncertain, reaching for clarity I was not obliged to provide. I listened, not out of duty, but out of curiosity. This was a new dynamic, and I wanted to observe it without interference. I kept my responses brief and factual. I confirmed what needed confirming and declined to fill in what had never been requested before. There was no satisfaction in withholding information, only balance. I had learned that explanation, when offered too freely, often serves the comfort of the listener rather than the truth. After the call ended, I returned the phone to the counter and stood by the window. A neighbor walked past, carrying a bag of empty bottles toward the recycling bin. The ordinary motion grounded me. Outside this house, the day continued as it always had, indifferent to the recalculations taking place elsewhere. The messages continued to arrive, some congratulatory, some curious, some poorly disguised as concern. I skimmed a few, archived the rest. Exposure, I understood, was not the same as recognition. People saw the result, not the years of preparation that made it inevitable. That was fine. I had not built this moment for applause. What mattered was the shift I could feel settling into place. The assumptions that had once protected others from having to see me clearly no longer held. I was not a background constant anymore, not a reassuring absence of change. The questions were coming from a different direction now, and they carried weight. I did not mistake this for reconciliation. Awareness does not undo habit, and surprise does not equal understanding. But the balance had moved, and with it, the terms of every conversation that would follow. I turned away from the window and picked up my notebook, already aware that the next decisions would require the same restraint that had brought me here. If you're still watching and felt the shift when the question suddenly changed direction, comment number 6 below to show you're still here. What follows is where silence starts creating consequences for everyone else. Let's move on to Chapter 7. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded in layers, each one revealing how far my absence had been mistaken for insignificance. By the afternoon of January 1st, the family group chat reappeared on my phone after months of dormancy, the screen filled with messages that arrived too quickly to be casual. They were written in the language of urgency disguised as care, each sentence carefully shaped to sound reasonable. No one asked how I was. No one mentioned the holiday or the exclusion that preceded it. The focus was elsewhere: timing, exposure, messaging. Daniel's wife wrote about protecting the family image, about how quickly narratives form when they are not guided. Daniel followed with reminders about discretion, suggesting that silence from me could be misinterpreted if not managed correctly. I read every message twice, not because I needed to understand them, but because I wanted to be certain I was seeing them clearly. What struck me most was the familiarity of it all. This was the same pattern I had watched play out for years, only now the stakes had shifted. Concern was expressed as instruction. Inclusion was offered as a strategy. The underlying assumption remained unchanged, that my role was to stabilize whatever discomfort my presence had caused, even when I had done nothing at all. I did not respond. I set the phone face down and returned to the work I had planned for the day. That decision felt different from the silences that had come before. This was not retreat. It was refusal. I was no longer interested in smoothing over consequences that were not mine to carry. By the following morning, the professional impact became impossible to ignore. Daniel's name began appearing in conversations he could not control. Clients questioned why they were learning about his mother's work from industry publications rather than from him. Colleagues forwarded articles with polite inquiries that carried an edge. The credibility he had built on certainty and access was suddenly unstable. I learned these details indirectly through a mutual acquaintance who spoke carefully, as if unsure how much I already knew. I did know enough. I had been aware, even before all this, that Daniel occasionally referenced my background when it suited him. Not falsely, but selectively. My experience had functioned as a quiet credential, one that required no upkeep because it was never examined closely. Now it was being examined, and the gaps were showing. I felt no satisfaction in that realization, only recognition. More messages arrived. Some attempted reassurance, others hinted at urgency. All of them assumed that I would step in, clarify, redirect, or soften the situation. I did none of those things. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that silence could generate outcomes as effectively as speech. By not intervening, I allowed events to move according to their own logic. The results belonged to the choices that had shaped them. Emotionally, I remained steady. There was no rush of vindication, no delayed anger finally finding release. Instead, there was a quiet alignment between what I had long observed and what was now visible to everyone else. Patterns, once exposed, lose their power to confuse. They become data. That afternoon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was sharp, and the ground still held traces of frost. Ordinary life continued around me, indifferent to reputations and recalibrations. I watched a delivery truck navigate the narrow street. The driver focused entirely on the next stop. The simplicity of that focus appealed to me. When I returned home, the phone remained untouched on the counter. I knew the messages would still be there later, unchanged by my attention. What mattered more was the boundary I had set without announcing it. I would not manage discomfort that had been created by excluding me. I would not participate in strategies that required my silence to be corrected rather than respected. The consequences were unfolding, and for once they did not require my labor to sustain them. That realization settled into place with surprising calm. Restraint, I saw now, was not a pause before action. It was the action itself. The days that followed settled into a quieter shape, one that felt earned rather than imposed. After the flurry of messages and implied urgencies, I returned to my routines with a different awareness. The house did not feel smaller for the attention it had briefly attracted. If anything, it felt steadier, as if the walls had decided what they would and would not absorb. I opened my email carefully, not out of fear, but out of discernment. The inbox had changed. There were invitations framed as opportunities, requests for interviews, and messages from intermediaries offering to manage visibility on my behalf. The language was familiar to anyone who has watched success become a commodity. I read enough to understand the intentions and archived the rest. Publicity did not interest me. Neither did the subtle pressure to perform gratitude for outcomes I had designed myself. What held my attention instead were the quieter messages that had always existed at the margins. A rural hospital administrator wrote about coverage gaps that forced patients to travel hours for care. A small pension board asked whether their projections could be rebuilt to reflect the realities they were seeing on the ground. An older analyst, recently laid off, asked if it was still possible to learn new tools without starting over at the bottom. These messages did not flatter me. They asked for work. I began to outline a structure that would allow me to respond without improvisation. Not charity, not patronage, but a fund with purpose and limits. I wanted sustainability, not spectacle. Dignity, not dependency. I consulted with counsel to ensure clarity, then set criteria that were deliberately narrow. The work had to solve a real problem. It had to build capacity rather than visibility. And it had to respect the intelligence of the people involved. As I reviewed proposals, I noticed how differently my body responded. There was no tightening in my chest, no sense of being pulled into someone else's agenda. The contrast with my family's demands was stark. Those messages sought control, reassurance, alignment. These requests sought function. They asked what could be done, not how it would look. I committed resources in stages, beginning with pilot projects small enough to measure honestly. A hospital received funding tied to outcomes rather than press releases. A pension group received revised models and training to maintain them independently. A cohort of older professionals gained access to updated tools and mentorship, not promises. Each decision felt precise, grounded in the same principles that had guided my work for decades. Emotionally, I felt settled. Not elevated, not vindicated, settled. The sense of being pulled between expectations had eased, replaced by a clear line between what I would carry and what I would not. I was no longer responding to pressure. I was acting on intention. In the evenings, I returned to my notebooks, this time to sketch long-term frameworks rather than immediate solutions. I thought about time horizons, about what it means to build something that outlasts attention. The future did not need to be announced to be real. It needed to be designed. When I closed my laptop at the end of those days, the quiet returned in a different form. It was no longer the quiet of being left out or overlooked. It was the quiet of focus, of work aligned with values rather than validation. I understood then that this choice, more than any contract or headline, would define what came next. I had not stepped away from conflict. I had stepped toward construction. And for the first time, the direction felt entirely my own. If you're still watching and curious how this all truly ends, not with revenge, but with something far more lasting, comment number 8 below to let me know you're ready. The final chapters bring the kind of ending most people never expect. Let's move toward the conclusion. Some weeks passed before Daniel reached out again. By then, the urgency had drained from the situation, leaving behind something more cautious. His message was brief and carefully worded, asking whether we could talk sometime soon. There was no apology embedded in it, no attempt to revisit what had already happened. It read like a request made out of necessity rather than reflection. I read it once, then set the phone aside and finished what I was doing before deciding how or whether to respond. I had learned that immediacy often creates the illusion of importance. Distance, us, on the other hand, has a way of clarifying intent. When I did reply, I suggested a time without offering a location or expectation. I did not frame it as reconciliation. I framed it as conversation, conditional and open-ended. That distinction mattered more to me than I had anticipated. When we finally spoke, the exchange was restrained. Daniel sounded more careful than I had ever heard him, as though he were navigating a room whose layout had changed while he was away. He spoke about confusion, about pressure, about how quickly things had shifted around him. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask what the experience had been like for me. Instead, he circled the edges of the situation, testing whether the old patterns might still apply. I listened without interruption. I noticed how little effort it took to remain calm. The need to explain myself had fallen away somewhere along the line, replaced by something steadier. When I did speak, I did not recount events or defend decisions. I told him that I was willing to talk when the purpose was understanding rather than control. The words came out evenly, without emphasis. They did not require reinforcement. There was a pause after that, longer than any that had come before. I could hear him adjusting again, this time not to new information, but to the absence of accommodation. I understood then that the distance between us was no longer accidental, had been set deliberately, and it was holding. Ending the conversation felt simpler than I expected. There was no rupture, no dramatic close. We agreed to speak again at some point, without committing to when or why. That ambiguity, once intolerable to me, now felt honest. It left room for change without demanding it. Afterward, I sat at the kitchen table and considered what had shifted. I did not feel triumphant or wounded. What I felt was adjusted, as if a long-standing imbalance had finally been corrected. The closeness I had once tried to preserve at my own expense was no longer the measure of connection. Respect had taken its place, imperfect and incomplete, but real. I understood that this version of our relationship might never resemble what others expected. It might never return to familiarity or ease, but it was grounded in something more sustainable than obligation. It did not require me to be smaller or quieter than I already was. As the afternoon light moved across the floor, I accepted that distance was not the same as loss. Sometimes it was simply the space required for roles to be renegotiated. What remained after that space was set felt less fragile than what had existed before. It felt chosen, and that was enough. The quiet that surrounds me now is different from the one I once feared. It is not the quiet of exclusion or waiting, not the stillness that follows being overlooked. It is chosen, deliberate, and steady. On most mornings, I sit at the same kitchen table where so many decisions were made without ceremony, and I watch the light move across the floor as the day begins. Nothing announces itself. That feels right. I think sometimes about that New Year's Eve, about how easily I was set aside and how small the moment seemed at the time. I did not know then that it marked a turning rather than an ending. I had believed belonging was something granted by proximity, by invitation, by inclusion in other people's plans. I understand now that it was always something else. It was authorship. It was the ability to decide where my energy would go and what it would be used to build. The work continues quietly. Projects move forward without headlines. People solve problems they once thought were fixed, and they do so without needing to know my story. That anonymity does not diminish the impact. It protects it. I have learned that attention is not proof of value, and absence is not evidence of failure. The world is full of structures that hold because no one is watching them closely. Family remains what it is, neither repaired nor destroyed. Distance has given it a shape that no longer requires me to bend. I no longer mistake access for intimacy or obligation for care. What persists does so because it can, not because it must. That distinction has made everything else easier to carry. In the afternoons, I often walk the perimeter of the yard, checking the fence line, noticing which trees have weathered the winter best. These small observations ground me. They remind me that endurance is rarely dramatic. It is incremental, quiet, and cumulative. Things last because they are tended, not because they are praised. I do not feel the need to correct anyone's assumptions anymore. The version of me that required explanation has been retired. In her place is someone who understands that dignity does not ask permission and power does not need to be displayed to exist. My life moves forward now on terms I have written myself, and the silence that accompanies it is no longer empty. It is full of intention, and that is enough. There are moments in life when silence feels like absence, when being overlooked seems like proof that something essential is missing. Yet with time, perspective shifts. What once felt like exclusion can become clarity. When we stop measuring our worth by invitations, recognition, or approval, we begin to see how much strength exists in choosing our own direction. Quiet work, done with intention, often reshapes the world more lastingly than noise ever could. Dignity grows when it is no longer negotiated, and peace settles in when control is released. The most meaningful turning points rarely arrive with applause. They arrive when we decide to stand firmly inside our own values and let everything else adjust around that choice. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If any part of it resonated with your own experiences, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. Please consider liking, following, and subscribing to the channel so you do not miss future stories like this one.